All right, hello everybody. Thanks for coming to this presentation about ABQ Ride Forward and our proposed draft recovery network. Um, with me are Aaron Sussman and Kelsey Walker with Tool Design, and they will be doing most of this presentation. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction. I'm Andrew DeGarmo. I'm a principal planner with ABQ Ride, and I'm the project manager for the ABQ Ride Forward network plan. And just a little bit of explanation, which I think Aaron and Kelsey will go into some more, but we're calling this our draft recovery network because have been very short staffed for the last year or two. So we're only running about 63% of our pre-pandemic service. So this is our plan for as we're able to hire staff back over the next couple of years. This is our proposal for how we would put that service back to get back to the level of service we had before the pandemic. As you'll see, it's not quite in the same arrangement as it was before. And I think with that, Aaron, am I forgetting any other points that I should make before you get started?
No, I think we can jump in. Thanks, Andrew.
Great. All right.
All right, thanks again, and thanks for listening in. So again, my name is Aaron Sussman. I'm a planner with a firm called Tool Design. Kelsey Walker and myself are based in Albuquerque. We're part of a consulting team that includes Jarrett Walker and Associates, who are really the architects for the network redesign efforts. And then we are providing support locally, both as transit and users and transportation planners. So we're excited to continue to share the ABQ Ride Forward plan with everybody. So it's helpful to start with just stepping back for a minute and talking about why this is such an interesting and exciting opportunity. Because again, this is not the kind of thing that ABQ Ride does all the time. It's been decades since the city and ABQ Ride have had a chance to review the network holistically. And as Andrew mentioned, there have been significant service cuts and disruptions since the pandemic several years ago, partly informed and influenced by the pandemic, but also just sort of changing socially and culturally as well. There's differences and changes in travel patterns. And so what we see is that the number of people making commuting trips 5 days a week and at 8 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock in the morning and then leaving at 5 o'clock in the evening to return home is much lower than it was in the past. And what we now see with ABQ Ride is that the highest levels of ridership are midday rather than in the peak periods. So taking those sort of points as context, what we've done is undertaken this project and we've gone through multiple phases of outreach to understand transit service related priorities and then think about, as Andrew mentioned, as ABQ Ride is able to staff back up and address the shortages of drivers and mechanics, what should this network look like? And ultimately, where should future bus routes go? What times of day should they run? And how frequently? So what this recovery network proposes is to return to the total level of bus service, so the total number of buses that were on the road in 2019, but to do so in a way that aligns with the feedback that we've received over the last couple of years of this project. So we're now in this final phase of public engagement to present and refine the recovery network. This project began a couple of years ago, as I mentioned, with a thorough review of existing conditions. If you are interested in digging into this information, there's a report on the website, abqrideforward.com. And that really, again, was a baseline and foundation for us for understanding how is ABQ Ride performing and how does ABQ Ride compare to peer cities. And one of the things that we learned from that effort is that Albuquerque just simply has less transit service per person and fewer frequent transit services and fewer frequent routes than many peer cities. So what you see on the screen are maps of Albuquerque, Tucson, and Salt Lake City. The lines in the red are bus lines where a bus comes every 15 minutes or better. In Albuquerque, it's just really a couple of corridors, Central and San Mateo, but you can see in a peer city like Tucson, they have a much denser network of frequent corridors. They also just have more total service overall. But that's not to say that there's waste in the Albuquerque system. There just isn't enough service being provided. And then that service has been forced to be contracted because of the shortages of drivers and mechanics over the last several years. So you can see the service and what the service map looked like in 2019 versus 2024. And you see that sort of slimming down of the network, fewer lines, less of those frequent corridors and shown in purple and red colors today. And again, that's a function of the shortages of drivers and mechanics. What we do see, though, is that ABQ Ride's service is rather productive, and especially along the corridors where we have more frequent service. So corridors like Central and San Mateo, Lomas, Montgomery, Carlisle, Menaul, 4th Street, we have higher levels of ridership. And so you see that in the map on the right, which shows locations where people board ABQ Ride buses. It's important to note that not only is service productive in places where there's high frequent corridors, but a lot of that service is really oriented towards portions of the city with lower income populations. So what we've done as part of this study is to then take that existing conditions work and go out to the public and consider some really important questions related to the future of transit. It began with a phase where we asked high-level questions about priorities and trade-offs. It continued with a second phase where we put together some initial network concepts using a sort of budget neutral approach. So the same levels of service, but distributing that service in different ways. And all of that feedback and information that we gathered during those first two phases is available online in a series of reports, and that informs this third phase that we're presenting here today. So as I mentioned, the first phase of outreach began with a really sort of critical and abstract question. We asked people, what kinds of transit routes do you think are better? Routes that are close by, but you have to wait a long time for the bus, or routes that are farther away, but the buses are always coming soon? And what we saw really consistently is, at least in the abstract, riders of all types and all income levels say that they prefer frequent routes, even if they're farther away. Among regular transit riders and lower income respondents, we also heard quite loudly and quite often the desire for more evening service and more weekend service. And that's consistent with service or with employment patterns where we've got more people working starting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and ending shifts at 9 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night in the service sector, for example. So with that, let me turn it over to Kelsey to talk about some of our findings from the second phase of this project.
Great. So in the second phase of this project, we were focused on developing two contrasting network concepts, which we called the high ridership concept and the high coverage concept. And these concepts were really developed as a tool to help better gauge people's values when it came to transit and what they were hoping to see from a potential network redesign. Throughout this presentation, we'll refer to these concepts as sort of budget neutral concepts because they do restore the 2019 system-wide level of service, but we want to emphasize that they're not truly budget neutral relative to 2019 because it costs much more to provide that level of service today. So this slide shows what those two concepts look like. On the left, there's the high ridership concept, which concentrates service into a small number of relatively frequent routes. So there are a lot more red lines and purple lines that are coming, that represent buses coming every 15 minutes or less, or every 20 minutes. But service doesn't go everywhere. There are portions of the city that don't have any type of route in the high ridership concept. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of the slide, there's the high coverage concept, which really spreads service around, but very few routes are frequent. So there are very few routes that are every 15 minutes or less. And so everyone is close to some amount of service, but it's often every hour or every 30 minutes, which isn't always as convenient. So when we think about these two concepts, the high ridership concept has fewer people in close proximity to transit, but there are more people that can access jobs and destinations within a 45-minute trip because the buses are coming frequently, and so they spend less time waiting for the bus to arrive. And that's actually why we call it the high ridership concept, because there's data from cities across the country and across the world that these types of frequent services that are convenient and people don't have to build their lives around the schedule do result in more ridership. The high coverage concept places more people in close proximity to some form of transit service. But because the most of that service is infrequent and only every 30 minutes or every 60 minutes. There are fewer people that can access jobs and destinations within a 45-minute trip because the service is much more spread out and people spend a lot longer waiting for a bus to arrive or waiting to transfer between buses. So after developing these concepts with ABQ Ride staff and our full team, we went out to the public again for input on these network concepts. And we asked folks which concept they preferred, if they preferred the high ridership concept or the high coverage concept, or if they were totally neutral and torn between the two. And we heard from a lot of people that they liked the high ridership concept, but we also heard from a lot of people that they liked the high coverage concept. And so folks were really split. Overall, there was a very slight preference for ridership among all survey respondents, but among the lowest income respondents, there was a slight preference for the high coverage concept. And then regular transit riders who rode the bus every day or multiple times a week were evenly split between the high ridership and the high coverage concept. And so this was pretty common to hear this in other cities as well. But it really told us that people care about both of those goals. They want some level of service in most neighborhoods, but they also want those frequent and convenient transit routes. And then another thing that we heard from the most engaged participants who attended focus groups and small group discussions is that they were really interested in evening and weekend service as well. That brings us to where we are today, summer 2024, where we have the Draft Recovery Network that blends the high ridership and the high coverage concept. So this is a blend of both of those concepts because we heard that people wanted both values. They wanted that service in a lot of places, but also the frequent service as well. This really is a proposal. It's something that ABQ Ride is hoping to implement in some form in the future. And so we want really, really detailed feedback to know about how that will work for you and if there are any small changes that can make it improve the proposal and make it a more functional network. Similar to the high ridership concept and the high coverage concept, this is budget neutral in the sense that it restores the system-wide level of service that was present in 2019. So why is ABQ Ride pursuing a recovery network? First of all, ABQ Ride, like many transit agencies across the country, has cut service since the pandemic due to a shortage of bus drivers and maintenance workers. You can see in this graph that many transit agencies are providing less service per capita, so less service per person. And at first in the pandemic, that was due to sort of immediate public health crises. But increasingly, that's continued because of a lack of bus drivers and maintenance workers and challenges hiring those two roles. But since 2021, ridership on the ABQ Ride system has been bouncing back. And this is common in peer cities as well. But it's really quite striking because ABQ Ride is providing less and less bus service, but more and more people are riding. And so we feel strongly that if ABQ Ride can move towards that level of service that they provided in 2019, even more people would be choosing to ride the bus because it would be more frequent, more convenient, and go more places. However, given that some of those labor challenges and hiring challenges are still present, it will take time to return to those pre-pandemic service levels. And because of inflation and all of the changes in labor costs, we know that returning to pre-pandemic levels of service will cost more than it did before. And so ABQ Ride's budget will need to grow significantly to achieve this. I'm going to talk about a few key principles that we thought about while designing this proposed recovery network. And then Erin and I will both go into a little bit more detail about what that specifically looks like. So the first key principle I want to highlight about this network is that there are more frequent routes. So there's just simply a greater number of routes that come every 15 minutes or better. There's also much more service on evenings and weekends, because we heard that from folks in both phases of outreach previously. And there's also a restructuring and reconfiguration of routes in select areas. And so because this is a budget constrained plan, these three principles are kind of a package deal. Number one, more frequent routes, and number two, sort of more service on evenings and weekends are typically pretty uncontroversial. They make transit riders' trips easier, if anything else. But number three, sort of that restructuring and reconfiguration of routes has mixed impacts. It will benefit some people, it might harm other people, or kind of adversely impact a few existing riders. But that reconfiguration of routes is really what generates sort of efficiencies that can help pay for higher frequency and more service on evenings and weekends throughout the system. And so we really, really want to be upfront about that. And we really want to hear from you all at this stage if those sort of reconfigurations of specific routes, which Erin will talk about a little bit more in a moment, are sort of worth it if they justify the improvements elsewhere throughout the system. So to go into a little bit more detail about the first two principles, all routes on this system are all day and 7 days a week. So there are not any routes that stop service on Sunday. They all run throughout the week. There's also a huge shift of service from weekdays and especially sort of morning and afternoon peak commuting times to weekends and evenings. This means that there's a longer span of service, so buses will be operating for more hours per day for most routes. And it really opens up more options to get where you need to go via transit in the evenings and on weekends. And this is really reflective of the shift in travel patterns that we've seen since the pandemic, with fewer and fewer people making those 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. trips to and from job centers. And when we look at this draft recovery network, there's actually very little loss of coverage relative to the service that was provided in the midday in 2019. There are a few losses in coverage that Erin will talk about, but the main changes from the 2019 network are that some of the peak hour commuting buses, like on Comanche and Candelaria, which only had a few trips per day, are no longer sort of lines on the map, and that service has been reallocated elsewhere. So the next few maps are going to show both today's existing network and the proposed recovery network at different times of day. And so throughout all of these maps, you may have caught on to this by now, but the red lines are the frequent routes that run every 15 minutes or better. And then the lightest blue lines represent routes that run every 60 minutes, and the other colors fall somewhere in between. So this is what both networks look like at midday. And you can see in the recovery network that there are more frequent routes. So there are new frequent routes on Lomas and Manal. There's also high frequency restored to San Mateo and the far eastern portion of Central. That's highlighted here. When we go to the weekends, you'll see that the recovery network looks really similar to how it does during the day, but there is some fading of service in today's network. And so this overall recovery network in general, it tries to keep much more consistent schedules across the evenings and the weekends as it has at midday. This is what it looks like at Sunday at midday. So you can see that service is still there 7 days a week in a way that it sort of drops off today. There is a decline in both systems of service in the evenings. It does sort of taper off towards the end of the day, but you can see that in the recovery network at Saturdays at 9 p.m., there's a much more robust set of services still running that can really help people travel at that time. So I'm going to hand it over to Aaron, who's going to talk about some of the specific route reconfigurations and service changes that help kind of generate that extra service money for the higher frequency and longer span of service.
Thanks, Kelsey. So there's a few key parts of Albuquerque that we wanted to really highlight. The first of which is in Southeast Albuquerque and the East Central Avenue corridor in particular. This is a very high ridership corridor. A lot of folks who rely quite heavily on transit. So we've looked at this area very, very intensively. But as Kelsey indicated, we do want to think about sort of ways to reconfigure the system to meet these other objectives in terms of longer span of service, more service on evenings and weekends. So the recovery network that's shown in the map on the bottom has a couple of key changes from service today. So the first is that the Albuquerque Rapid Transit Green Line, which currently runs from Central and Unser all the way out to Tramway, we're proposing that service as part of the recovery network basically becomes a local service east of Louisiana Boulevard where the dedicated infrastructure stops. So that bus would then stop every few blocks or so, shorter stop spacing to improve access to the ART Green Line. Part of that is a proposal that would have Route 66, the 66 Central bus, which currently runs out to Tramway, terminate service at Wyoming Boulevard, but weave its way through the International District to provide more direct service to residents in that area south of Central and to the east of San Pedro Boulevard. Those again kind of go hand in hand, so the efficiencies and reductions in service along the Route 66 are complemented and replaced by the service along East Central, where the buses are stopping much more frequently. That's shown in this stretch here. Part of this as well is some modest changes to some other routes. So Route 16 in particular is simplified. So rather than sort of weaving its way back and forth, north and south with connections to Central, it would provide service from the VA hospital around Central or around Gibson and San Mateo directly into downtown. And then the Route 97 bus, which runs along Zuni and Leaded Coal, would be discontinued, but key portions of that corridor would be replaced by the Route 66. Going through the International District. You also see on this map that other corridors and routes have that sort of deep red color that indicates the higher frequency service, including along Lomas Boulevard, which provides added service to this part of the city of Albuquerque. In Southwest Albuquerque, we propose some similar changes and reconfiguration. So one of which is that every other ART Green Line, so again, the 777, which runs out to Tramway, and which currently runs as far as the Central and Unser Transit Center, every other bus would turn north on Coors and become a continuous route on Coors. So then you could go from the Northwest Transit Center down to Central Ave via Coors into downtown and other parts of Central Avenue without requiring a transfer at any point. In sort of a similar approach, every other ART Red Line or 766 would continue past the Central and Unser Transit Center and then turn south on 98th Street before terminating at the South Valley Plaza around Rio Bravo and Coors Boulevard to increase opportunities for people from the South Valley area and Southwest Mesa to access transit and then get into downtown UNM area, other parts of Central Avenue, again, without requiring a transfer. In a similar manner as some of these other sort of deviations, rather than again terminating at Central and Unser, the Route 66 would continue south from Coors Boulevard before ultimately terminating at that South Valley Plaza. So that South Valley Plaza becomes a really critical transit node in that Southwest Mesa area, a part of the city of Albuquerque that's not quite as well served by transit today as we believe it would be with the recovery network. You'll see in these shaded areas that on the map, we're proposing something that are called demand response zones. We'll talk about those more in a minute, but the idea is that we're looking for ways to provide service where there's some gaps in the network and gaps in the system here. Another really important thing to mention, and Kelsey alluded to this earlier, that there are some routes where because of the reconfigurations, we're just not providing quite the same level of service to some places in the recovery network as today. And so in particular along Isleta Boulevard, The Route 53 bus would not travel as far south in the recovery network as it does today. It would travel south on Isleta to Don Felipe, but then would tie in again to that South Valley Plaza to provide that real kind of transit node and nexus in that portion of the city. We're also proposing some significant changes around the university area, and in particular service along University Boulevard. And in particular here, we're talking about the stretch between Indian School Road and Avenida Cesar Chavez. This is a corridor that's been identified as a high priority in a number of recent plans and studies. It's also a corridor that's filled with key destinations: CNM main campus, UNM main campus, the UNM South Campus and sports and athletic facilities, North Campus, and the UNM Hospital. So you can see the sort of distribution of destinations along this corridor. What's important, though, is that there's no service really tying these places together, and there's pretty limited service right now to CNM main campus in particular. And so what's being proposed as part of the recovery network is a reconfiguration of Route 5. And so for those of you who are really familiar with this route, it currently goes along Montgomery and then south along Carlisle and then into downtown via Lomas Boulevard. This would be reconfigured to go east along or west, east-west along Indian School and then north-south along University Boulevard before going into downtown via Avenida Cesar Chavez. That's a way to still provide direct service from the Northeast Heights into downtown and on the western side of UNM, but to provide direct access and connections to CNM and also to then create connections between downtown and CNM and the Northeast Heights and CNM that don't exist quite as well today. Having this kind of more frequent service and frequent routes also speaks to the benefits of the recovery network as a whole. This emphasis on frequent routes means that it's much easier to transfer from one line or one route to the next. So the intersections of Lomas and University Boulevard and University and Central can become really important access or transfer points, and in particular, a way that folks can transfer from the ART lines along Central Ave and get then north-south to other destinations along the corridor, including to CNM. So I mentioned demand response zones. This is another important and fairly new strategy and technique that ABQ Ride is proposing as part of the recovery network. The idea is that there are some areas in the city of Albuquerque that just don't have enough demand to justify all-day fixed route service, but there are folks in these areas who do need access to transit. And so the proposal with these demand response zones is to create a sort of on-demand service where passengers can request a trip to a set of transfer points and then connect to the rest of the network. And so the idea is that rather than just calling an Uber and getting you door to door exactly where you need to go, you could request a ride though. And if you're coming from the North Valley, it might take you to a place on the edge of this demand response zone, such as the Montano Transit Center, where then you could access a number of other routes and from there get to the rest of the city of Albuquerque. ABQ Ride has been operating a pilot program called ABQ Ride Connect. This is a similar proposal, the demand response zones, that would build off of that pilot program. There's a lot of details that still need to be refined, but this is again a strategy to sort of fill in some of those gaps that are provided by this reconfiguration of services. So I want to take a step back again and just think about the overall system. Again, the recovery network is more streamlined, but that does not mean that it limits access to services. And so overall, what we see is that it does not change the number of residents that are near transit at times of day when transit is being utilized the most, in particular, weekdays at midday. We also have ways of measuring how productive and valuable we think the recovery network will be and how it will perform. And so in particular, there's a major increase in the number of residents and jobs that are located within a half mile of frequent service. So again, updating the number of frequent routes means that more people are in proximity to those routes that are coming more often. It makes it easier to build your day and build a set of trips around that frequent service. With that, we see significant increases in specific populations that have access to frequent service. So, for example, on the aggregate, overall, the number of residents across the city of Albuquerque that are within a half mile of frequent service doubles from 11% to 22%. We also see big increases in access or proximity to transit and proximity to frequent transit among low-income residents and non-white residents. And then from a jobs standpoint, there's a significant increase in the number of jobs that are located in proximity to this frequent service. We can also look at this geographically. And so what you see on the screen is a concentrations of green dots across the city of Albuquerque. And these essentially represent locations where access to jobs increases as part of the recovery network. Overall, there's an increase in 32% of jobs that are reachable within 45 minutes via transit at midday on weekdays. There are some locations, though, shown in brown, the South Valley, Southwest Mesa, North Valley, where we see that access to jobs is not as good in the recovery network as it is today. What's not reflected in this map or the model that was used to create this data is the role of the demand response zones. And so again, those demand response services are an attempt to sort of fill in those gaps and ensure to the best that ABQ Ride can, that those losses in access can be mitigated. So finally, we want to invite you to explore this data for yourselves. On the website, there's an interactive map where you can select a point and assess whether the recovery network improves access to job sites from any location across the city of Albuquerque. So the image on the screen shows, what happens if we stick that point around the Frontier restaurant around Central and Cornell. And what we see is that from that point, there's a pretty significant increase in the distances that one can travel, as shown in those travel time contours, and then the number of jobs that can be accessed starting from that point in set periods of time. So we encourage you to go online and to check this out and place points around the city and see how the recovery network would perform. Overall, what we generally see is that there's some areas with major gains in access, including downtown, and there's other parts where the changes are fairly minimal, including Northwest Albuquerque. So again, we encourage you to go online to explore both the recovery network and then the 2024 network to see the differences and to see how those changes in access can be quantified. So what we'll close with is just to encourage you to provide your comments and feedback. One of the main ways we're getting feedback through this final phase is through a survey that's available through mid-September. And what we're looking for through that survey is feedback on the overall impacts and benefits of the recovery network. And then we're also welcoming thoughts on individual routes. We're hosting throughout the month of August a number of small group discussions. There's a brief survey where you can sign up or pick times that work for you on the project website. Again, it's abqrideforward.com. And again, that website has lots of materials and opportunities for you to dig into these products at your leisure and send us your comments. So with that, we just want to close out this presentation and thank everybody for your time. And again, invite you to email members of the project team and very much encourage your comments. Thank you for your participation and encourage you to please fill out the survey and encourage others to do so as well.